Welcome back to Inside City Hall. While much attention is being paid to the negotiations during the long end of the legislative session in Albany, here in the city, talks are coming to an end surrounding the city budget. And besides the usual discussion over the long-term fiscal health of our city, there have also been concerns over a number of issues, including funding for more police officers, for parks, for libraries, and for both youth and senior services. Joining me now to talk it all over, we've got Bronx Councilwoman Vanessa Gibson, who chairs the council's Public Safety Committee. Manhattan Councilman Mark Levine is the chair of the Parks Committee, and Queens Councilman Jimmy Van Bramer is the council's majority leader, as well as the chair of the Cultural Affairs Committee and co-chair of the council's budget negotiating team. Welcome to all of you. Good to see you. Thanks for taking out some time. You guys have been busy while everybody's been looking at Albany. And let me start with you. You're on the budget negotiating team, Jimmy. Who else is on that team, and who's on the mayor's side of the table?
Well, there are about 12 members of the budget negotiating team that is selected by the speaker. All 5 boroughs are represented, and we are a team that obviously works closely with the speaker on this, and obviously the mayor has his team, Dean Foulahan, taking the lead, I think, in the negotiations there, and our finance division, and obviously our speaker as our leader. But the budget negotiating team really is there to reflect the will of the 51 council members, and I think this speaker has really sought to have an open and transparent process within the body that empowers all 51 members, so it's not a top-heavy approach. It's really all 51 members' voices being heard equally with respect to the budget.
So this sounds like a lot of people, actually. Where do you guys meet? You go to a diner or something like that?
No, we meet at City Hall.
Okay.
We met in the Red Room just less than an hour ago. The budget negotiating team broke up with the latest updates on where we're at, and working with all of the delegations who had meetings throughout the day. So it is a very, very inclusive and collaborative process, but obviously ultimately at the end of the day, the mayor and the speaker will conclude with a deal that reflects the work that we've all been doing as a body over the last several weeks and several months.
Let me ask you, just because you have experience as a former member of the Assembly, compare what goes on in the council to what goes on in Albany, where in Albany, my understanding is nothing's done until everything's done, and they come out with a very complicated deal that touches on a lot of unrelated items. Is that what's happening at the council as well, or is it sort of maybe a little more methodical?
So I think the council process is much more hands-on. The budget negotiating team, our delegations that meet constantly, that really provide the opportunity for all members to be engaged, to make decisions that are reflective of not just our borough, but as a city. It's much, much more different. It's much more hands-on. It's much more inclusive. It is a smaller body of government, only 51 compared to 150, 106 Democrats in the Assembly. I've had a really good opportunity. This is my second budget year. I've learned a lot from last year, and I really think that this process under the leadership of our speaker has really been transparent, has really been inclusive to make sure that everyone has a voice in the decision-making process.
Let me ask you about one of the big ticket items that's gotten a lot of discussion, which is the 1,000 cops. It was talked about last year, it's talked about this year. I heard at one point the commissioner throw out a possible number of 300. Where do things stand now?
So things obviously are still on the table in terms of the conversations between the council and the administration, in terms of raising the headcount at the police department. But let me also say, when you look at public safety, it's much more than raising the headcount at the police department. It's also civilianization, where civilians could replace police officers doing administrative work. For me, a personal project is school safety agents and school crossing guards, which I think we really need to look at recruitment and retention and raising the salary and improving the conditions for many of them. Anti-gun violence, we expanded to almost 17 neighborhoods last year. We want to make sure we provide more support and resources for many of our anti-gun violence providers doing the Cure Violence model. I think it's a lot. It's also a heavy focus on youth. We're looking at increased slots for summer youth employment program, but also an all-year youth employment program, because we want to make sure that during the non-summer hours that young people are able to have access to economic development and employment opportunities
So
as well.
I know it's not necessarily your committee, but are you saying that you regard the summer jobs program and other youth employment programs as a public safety matter?
Absolutely. I think this is all relative. Everything is relative. Senior services, services for youth, housing, parks. I think all of these quality of life priorities that we're making necessary decisions about. I think it's all relative. When we talk about the summertime and we know that there are high instances of crime in certain communities across the city, we can address that, the roots of the problem, by dealing with a lot of the issues and challenges facing our young people, and a lot of that is access to jobs.
Okay, Mark Levine, the mayor's calling for an additional $1.27 billion, or a total of $1.27 billion spending on parks, including an extra $150 million for some of the smaller neighborhood parks. I've heard a lot of discontent from your committee and its chair. Does the mayor have the priorities wrong? Is it just not enough money? What's the problem?
Well, the parks budget has been stagnating for years. We only devote about 1/2% of the city's total budget to parks. It was triple that in the 60s. It's far more than that in other cities around the country. And you see it in our park system today. Parks that are not maintained to the level that New Yorkers demand. You see it especially in parks that don't have the benefit of private money coming in. Sure, Central Park is doing great. They're getting millions in private revenue. Prospect Park, the High Line, and that's wonderful. But for parks in low and moderate income communities, they need robust public investment from a park system, which they're not currently getting. In fact, the budget as it stands would require a cut of 150 gardeners and maintenance workers. We're working to restore that, obviously, in the final negotiations. You asked about capital spending, and say what you will about the Bloomberg era parks policies, some of which I've been very critical of. They did invest in a big way in capital projects, creating Brooklyn Bridge Park and Governor's Island and the High Line and so many more. And we want to see that kind of big vision, ambitious projects for public space in the next 10-year capital plan.
Well, what's your take on an issue that was raised by the New York Times, which is that maybe the mayor doesn't really like parks? They say that neither he nor the First Lady has attended any Central Parks Conservancy events. He's never come to the High Line, which is right behind the building. He's certainly been in this building quite a lot. Does he like parks?
The mayor loves parks. Prospect Park was his home neighborhood park. It was part of his council district. He has a very deep attachment to that park and many others. I don't think there's a question of philosophical differences here, but at the end of the day, you need resources to run a great park system, and that's exactly the kind of negotiation that we're working through right now.
The overall increase of $50 million that was reported is not sufficient, I take it, from your point of view?
Well, look, that's mostly inflation and labor contracts. The head count is almost exactly the same as it currently stands. But today there's 4,000 people in the Parks Department. There were 6,000 in decades past. So we're starting from a very low base. And there's no way to maintain a park system of 29,000 acres without having the staff out there. We have 1,700 parks. This is not easy to do. It's not cheap to do. It's incredible how much the Parks Department does do on a limited budget. But in our council districts, we feel the lack of resources. This is a public policy issue that affects health, safety, environmental resilience, public safety, property values. Great parks make for great neighborhoods and a great city.
Well, unfortunately, this is a sort of a money and head count question, the way you're describing it, right? So unlike some other issues, it's not a yes-no proposition. You might not get the 2,000 or 3,000 additional workers you want, but you might get some, right? Is that what you're negotiating for?
Well, we'll find out. Currently, the head count is virtually flat, and we're hoping that between what the mayor can put in and the council can put in, we'll be able to avoid cuts in gardeners and maintenance workers and add two important things. You know, we want to extend the season for beaches and pools. Currently, they close on Labor Day. It can still be very hot in September, and we want New Yorkers to be able to enjoy these resources well past Labor Day. That requires money, requires more staff, lifeguards and others. So one of our requests in the council's budget response was for money to extend the beach season through that additional staffing.
Okay, a very good idea and a popular one with a lot of people. Let's talk libraries,
Yes,
Jimmy Van
let's
Bramer.
do
You
that.
used to work for the Queens Library System before you got elected to office, so you know this upside down, inside out. You have the largest ever capital commitment for libraries, and yet still I get a lot of stuff in my inbox saying the mayor's cutting too much from libraries, pick up the phone and complain. What's the story?
Well, it's both, right? So we have about a $1.5 billion documented need in terms of repair upkeep for our libraries in the city of New York. No one disputes that number. Dean Foulahan agrees that's a real number. And the libraries have never been in the city's 10-year capital plan. So the library systems, myself, all of us at the council have been pushing very hard. For the first time ever, this administration did include libraries in the 10-year capital plan at $300 million. That's historic, and they deserve credit for that. It is still a far cry from the $1.5 billion that are needed, though. So we are now continuing to push the administration to do even more on the capital side, because while we are very much pushing for $65 million in the expense side this year for full 6-day service at every neighborhood library, the truth is if you have the library open but its roof is leaking, or the air conditioning is not working in the summer, or the heat is not working in the winter, it's impossible to use that library and for children to learn in the way that they deserve to be learning.
With $300 million, even committed over 10 years, is there a way to leverage private funds or leverage additional funds? I mean, you know, if you only need 5 times as much as you're getting committed over a 10-year period, it seems to me you should be able to get the rest of it, right?
Sure. Well, you know, I think that some of our library systems have more access to private dollars than others, right? So it's not the same for all 3 systems, and I think they all do as much as they possibly can. But I do think that those funds are limited in some respects, and I would argue that there is a fundamental obligation on the part of the City of New York to fund and care for those buildings, which are city-owned buildings. So we are obligated to pay for those libraries, which are on city-owned property. They're city-owned buildings. That's our work to do, and I believe this administration is committed to getting that done. Obviously, we are continuing to push for even more, and obviously the Speaker has been leading this charge incredibly effectively, and obviously we'll know soon, hopefully in a matter of days, just where we end up on libraries. But it is absolutely essentially important that in this moment, when we are all focused on ending inequality across the board, that libraries are included, because you can't have a full-on war against inequality without fully funding our public libraries. They are essential. They are the front lines in that battle.
But politics is always about choices, never more so than in budget season. In our last couple of minutes, let's play a quick round of Name That Cut. You've laid out a lot of different priorities, all of which involve more money from the taxpayers, who are my viewers. Name an area where the city's wasting money, where you'd like to see us maybe save some money.
Consultants. I want us to reduce the exorbitant amount of consultants and outsourcing of jobs that we do, which really have a detrimental impact on our municipal workers and our city workers, as well as the level of services that we get. I want us to look at that, particularly at the Department of Ed. I feel we do a lot of consulting and contracts, and you know, I feel like we're looking at data that we pretty much know already, and I want to see if we can look at diverting many of those funds into critical areas of need.
Okay, Mark Levine.
How about we pull back on over-testing our kids in the public schools? We're spending millions of dollars going to outside companies to prepare those tests. We could give our kids a bit of relief and save a lot of money in the process. We could still assess kids in reasonable ways, but without the undue over-testing that's caused so much anxiety among kids, and I think even distorted the way we make decisions in our education
Interesting.
system.
Give me a cut, Jimmy.
I think the root of your question is whether or not our funding is being spent appropriately. I think the council has been focusing on making sure that the services that we are funding are actually being used. So I would argue that anything that we fund regarding city services that aren't being used in the way that we are advocating that they be used, those should be targeted for cuts. So if there's a center somewhere that isn't seeing the usage, then that's something that we should take a look at.
When has the council ever asked to close a community center of any kind?
I think that we have actually done work like this over the last several years. I've been in the council 5.5 years. I think that we have an obligation to be good stewards of public money. I think that we are, and I think the vast majority of things, all the things that we're talking about here, are good expenses of taxpayer dollars. But where that falls short, well, obviously we should look at it.
Okay. My own contribution, you can take this back if it's not too late for the negotiating team. Sanitation, when they're doing the recycling, the truck comes down the street 3 different times. 3 times on my side of the street, 3 times on the other side of the street. I can't think of anything more wasteful. There do exist trucks where you can sort of put it all in. You put the paper over here, and you put the bottles over there, and you put the garbage over there. Ties up traffic. It pollutes the air.
It's a little late in the negotiating process, Errol, but we will.
I have faith in you, Jimmy Van Bramer. Mark Levine and Vanessa Gibson, thank you all for coming by. Good luck getting this all wrapped up. Let's take a short break now. Coming up, we will talk about the week in politics, including a lack of action in Albany, with 4 top journalists in our Friday Reporters Roundtable. Stay with us.